All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. We really appreciate your time and joining us on this webinar. Um, Jeff Maddox from Fertrell is going to be giving a presentation on the golden rules for raising poultry. During the presentation, if anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat box. Everyone is going to be muted, so type your questions into the chat box and I will read them and Jeff will answer the questions to the best of his ability. So, all right, Jeff.
All right, so this evening we're going to talk about what I feel are the golden rules for raising poultry. The most important things to remember when you're keeping your chickens. So the three golden rules, and there's more golden rules, but the three most important rules for raising poultry, in my opinion, are air quality, water quality, and feed quality. So let's start with air quality because it's absolutely the most important. All right, so air quality, it's all about the freshness of the air, and you know who out there likes to have stinky, stale air? You know, anybody that enjoys walking into a chicken coop where it's humid and it's hot and it smells bad and they can smell ammonia. These are all problems. So try and set up any place you're keeping your chickens, whether it's a brooder or housing, where you can replace that air or have air exchange 4 to 6 times a day. Now that's all the air being exchanged 4 to 6 times per day. So it's 100% exchange. So keep in mind that fresh air is actually more important than what the temperature is. So if you're brooding chicks, yes, you want to keep them warm, but a temporary drop in temperature, for a half an hour or an hour is not going to kill those chicks. The fresh air is more important than the temperature. The other thing to keep in mind is inside that brooder, there's going to be formation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And this is going to occur if you're using a propane heater because it requires oxygen to burn that fuel. You're also going to have it from chickens using the oxygen in the air and exhaling. And the third thing is you're going to have it when the manure combines with the bedding and starts to compost, and you get the carbon to nitrogen exchange. This also requires oxygen. It's going to take oxygen out of the air. So these are the top three reasons why you're going to have reduced oxygen content in your chicken housing, wherever it is. Poultry housing that is too tight and does not have airflow, too tight on airflow, will build up with excess carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, or a combination of both. Reducing the oxygen content and will also reduce the immune system. So the carbon dioxide and monoxide are replacing or reducing total oxygen content in the air. And when it does that, it's going to reduce the immune system of the chicken or the overall health of the chicken. Now, when exchanging air, you want to avoid air that's coming in down at chick or down at ground level. Okay, you never want drafts. So you want to avoid drafts and airflow at ground level. Best thing you can consider is putting vents in the top of whatever the building is, whether it's a layer coop, brooder, or whatever, put them up near the top, put a vent on one end and put an exhaust fan on the other end that you can set up with a fairly inexpensive timer from any home improvement store and set it to run, 6 times a day, every 4 hours for 15 minutes. And that will exchange that air. Now, you need to put baffles in there or something to cause the air to change direction. Otherwise, the fan's going to draw air straight across the top and you're not going to get a whole lot of mixing. I like to use something that's semi-flexible or semi-rigid like cardboard. You hang that in front of the vent and that forces the air to have to change its pathway. So it's going to drop down and it's going to cause that air to start rolling and mixing with the air below it. And that's going to draft up a lot of the air from down where the birds are living. And it'll get rid of the excess moisture, the excess humidity, and the ammonia that's living down where your chicken is. Any questions on this slide?
No questions yet.
So air quality requirements. think about ammonia for a minute. If you can smell it, um, your chickens are already suffering because the poultry's threshold for ammonia content is well known to be 10 parts per million. And the human sense does not detect or can't smell ammonia below 25 parts per million. So by the time you can smell it, it's already too late. Lung damage has occurred. You're going to see decreases in growth rates or production. And if you're doing meat birds, you can expect the mortality level to be higher. Humidity also decreases oxygen levels in the air. Excess humidity in confined spaces is going to promote infectious respiratory diseases. High humidity is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, and it enhances bacterial and fungal growth. So the best way to actually control your humidity besides using the fan is by bedding management. So if you keep your bedding drier and cleaner, you're going to have less overall humidity in that barn. And fresh air is the most important thing to any living creature. Any questions on?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions on this slide. Can
Okay.
zeolite be used for ammonia control?
Zeolite can, and zeolite's a clay particle, and there's several clay particles out there that'll actually work very well. But clay particles like zeolite, Redmond conditioner, and years ago we used to recommend colloidal soft rock phosphate because it's a clay particle. And the reason these products work is because they are typically a negatively charged molecule. And ammonia is a positively charged molecule. So the two will naturally attract, and the clay will bind with the ammonia, rendering it non-harmful. Uh, so it will help. So there are additives like that are typically clay-based that will improve it'll improve the ammonia control within the house.
Okay. Also, how do you test ammonia levels?
So in the big commercial houses, they actually have electronic devices that can monitor ammonia levels, and they're tied into the fan system. So the fans will run when ammonia levels reach, get close to that 10 parts per million. On a smaller scale, like folks in their backyard are raising pastured poultry, this is not really a viable option due to the cost. We're just not going to raise enough chickens to justify the cost of an ammonia sensor, an electronic ammonia sensor. So there is a company out there now providing ammonia test strips, and it's similar to like a pH litmus test. You can pull out a piece of paper, you prep it, follow the directions, and you take it into the confined space or where you want to check that ammonia, and it will change color, and it gives you a scale to read whether or not the ammonia is too high or not. And so on a field scale or a small producer scale, the ammonia strip, test strips, is probably going to be your best option.
All right. I think that's all of the questions on that slide.
So we're going to move on to water quality, and a lot of this is, very much common sense. Is water freshness is critical, and so the common sense part of this is don't serve it unless you're willing to drink it. And if you're not willing to drink what you're giving your animals, then it's not good enough. Keep it fresh. Um, Keep in mind that water contaminants such as bacteria, whether E. coli or coliform, nitrates, hardness, and excess minerals are going to adversely affect the performance of your poultry, as well as water pH will also affect poultry performance. So you're looking for that ideal pH between 6.7 and 7. That's where the bird is going to be the healthiest, perform the best, and you're going to have the overall best results. In reality, you need to really get your water tested, not only for your poultry, but for your health as well as your poultry. So you know what you have, you know what concerns there might be, just for the $60 or $70 it costs to get your water tested. You're going to get that back, very quickly in bird performance and health, as well as your family's health and so on. So just get your water tested. Any questions on this slide?
No, they're not.
So continuing on with watering, um, not everybody realizes it, but the water to feed ratio is 2 to 1 by weight, and that's at an average temperature around 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So what that means is for every 1 pound of feed eaten, there's going to be 2 pounds of water consumed or drank. So this is an important number. People don't realize that water is twice as important as feed. And this is something you should try and figure out a way to monitor, because if you see a change in that water to feed consumption ratio, it's an indicator that there might be some health issues soon coming in your poultry flock. As the temperatures go up, the ratio of water to feed goes up. Same way if the temperature, outside temperature goes down, you could see a slight decline from the 2 to 1 where the water to feed ratio goes down. It's key to have enough space for at least 50% of your birds to be able to drink at the exact same time. This is something that you need to observe, when you're done doing your chores, feeding the birds, maybe flip over your bucket and watch to see if there's crowding. Whenever you're near your chickens, watch to see if the waters are crowded, if there's space for somebody to get another chicken to get up there and drink. So spacing for watering, I'm a big fan of. I like 1 inch of linear water space. That's straight. If your waters are a straight, piece of PVC pipe, some sort of trough, etc. I like to have 1 inch per bird per chick. This as soon as they arrive, day one, and you increase this by 1/4 of an inch weekly as they grow. If you're using round waters, which most people are, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch per bird should be fine for the first 8 weeks, or this is equivalent to about 50 birds per round water or round font. Um, Ideal temperature for water for chicks in the brooder when they first arrive is somewhere around 90 to 95 degrees. After the first week, water temperature can be 75 degrees. You still don't want it for chicks, don't want it to be extremely cold straight out of the well, but they can deal well with that 75 degrees afterwards. Any questions on this slide?
No, they're not.
So keep in mind that correct water height is fairly important. The lip of the water should be level with the average bird's back. If you look at this picture where they're drinking out of this tub, it's been elevated. The reason for that is chickens have to tilt their heads back in order to drink. They don't have tongues, they don't have lips, they can't do it the same way as you and I do and drink from any position. So the further that they have to tilt their head, the more they will spill. So it's going to fall out from their beak, and a fair amount of water is going to end up on the ground. And if they're still in some sort of a house where you're supplying the bedding, this is going to be wasteful. So if you get the water up, it's going to be more efficient, less water wasted. And just keep in mind that chickens don't have lips. Any questions on this slide?
No.
So for those of you who are using your children to tend to your chickens, something that you may want to keep in mind, this is what I did when we kept a control flock or a backyard flock of chickens at my house, is the water freshness test for teenagers. To know if your chickens are getting fresh water every day, get some water out of the chicken watering device, especially if it's a little bit dirty or whatever. Bring it back to the house. Give your teenager the choice to either drink the chicken water or go clean out the water. And this is truly one of those priceless moments that you'll have, while your children are growing up. So let's move on to feed quality requirements. First and foremost, the freshness of the feed. In my opinion, the freshness is the most important. And it's best if you can get the feed into the chickens within 14 days of it actually being processed at the feed mill. If you're buying commercially available feeds off the shelf at some local farm store, this isn't going to happen. All right, it's getting made in a large feed mill somewhere a long distance away. It sits in a distribution center for a couple of months before it ever gets to the store. Okay, so it's not fresh. Don't. So 14 days is really ideal if that's even possible for you. Um, a lot of people, have to deal with 30-day supplies, and I understand that. So try not to exceed 30 days as far as your feed freshness, and that is from the date that the feed is manufactured, not from the day you bought it. So we need to be concerned about the balance of the feed. The feed that you're buying needs to be the correct feed. It needs to align with the age and or the production level of the birds that you're keeping. I see this as a problem. People are wanting to feed one feed to all the birds that they have, and some are young and some are old and some are in between. And that necessarily is not the right idea. Some birds are going to thrive on that, and other birds are going to be deficient. Um, every year, I get 1 to 2 calls from folks that are raising layer chicks, but they get them as babies, and they feed them layer feed from day one, and that's not the correct feed. They needed a chick starter. Well, now they've ruined these birds because the excess amount of calcium in a layer feed is going to build up in the kidneys and crystallize, basically turn the kidneys into a large kidney stone. And those birds will never be able to fully function as a layer, and they're not going to be able to process proteins and excrete things as they should normally. Thirdly, mold and toxin free. Um, the feed should be free of molds and toxins. These are not things that you're going to be able to visually see or smell or be able to detect. So how do you know? Well, this is the area where you need to ask your feed mill, if they have a protocol or a system in place for testing their ingredients as they come in to make sure that they're within safe levels of mycotoxins or aflatoxin. The further south you go in the U.S., aflatoxins are more of an issue because of the hot, humid weather. But you need to ask them, and if they don't have a system in place or a protocol for testing these things, you probably should be looking for another feed mill. Uh, Mycotoxins are getting worse and worse in the feed supply system out there, so it's going to constantly be harder and harder to find high quality feed that have no mycotoxins or mold spores in it. Texture of the feed. Feed should be processed to the correct size for the poultry it's being fed. So younger chicks, when they're in the brooder, they need a slightly smaller particle size than an adult layer. You need to have a texture of feed that matches the age group of the poultry that you're raising. That being said, chicks don't need powder. A lot of people think that their chick feed needs to be powder because the bird can eat it better. In all actuality, powder is not a good thing for any class of poultry. So powder is bad. Keep that in your mind. Powder is bad. So for chicks, we're looking for something that's roughly 1/8 of an inch up to not quite 1/4 of an inch in particle size. 3 millimeters would be the correct size. And then adult birds like layers or other adult type poultry can handle particle sizes above 1/4 of an inch, even up to 3/8 of an inch would be the largest, I would think. But that's going to be the appropriate texture. And grit, I find that grit is being ignored by a large majority of poultry owners out there, and they don't understand how important grit is for all stages and ages of poultry. Proper gut health is very dependent on the gizzard, which is the muscle that grinds the feed. Inside there's this large, dense muscle that the coarse feed comes into, and it gets ground up and pulverized and turned into a mush. And that grinding action actually drives a lot of the rest of the metabolism of the chicken and its health. Any questions on this slide?
Yes. So for broilers, when can you start increasing the particle size?
So Broilers, you can start increasing the particle size pretty much at the end of week 3. They're going to start craving larger pieces, and that particle size after week 3 can be the equivalence of the same size as a grain of wheat. So you're looking at something maybe an eighth of an inch wide and a quarter of an inch long. That's really the ideal size for chicken feed across the board. It can be a little bit more coarse for laying hens, but if you think about the size of a grain of wheat, that is a really good particle size for poultry.
And that applies to heritage breeds as well.
It does apply to heritage breeds as well.
Okay. Um, there's another question. Are crumbles suitable for poultry of all ages?
Um, so crumbles are more suitable for chicks in that first 3 to 5 weeks of age, depending on whether it's a commercial breed or a heritage breed. The particle size starts to get a little bit too small for older birds. So it's not the effective particle size for an adult bird like a layer or when they're nearing maturity. Pretty much after week 5 for most poultry classes, a crumble is not the ideal size. It'll work. It'll work if that's all you have available to you. It's fine, but it's not ideal.
Will you see more waste feeding crumbles to older birds?
I typically see a little bit more waste feeding crumbles to older birds because they're looking for bigger pieces. The nature of a chicken is to find the biggest piece first. And so they're going to sort and they're going to look for that size that they're desiring. And they're going to eat the big pieces first, which means they're going to shovel around with their beaks the feed that's in the feeder, looking for the big pieces first, and then they'll slowly eat the remaining pieces.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions on that slide.
So continuing on with feeding, basics and essentials, much like the water that we talked about earlier, you want to keep the rim or the lip of the feeder even or at the same height as the average bird's back. And you can look at the picture that I've provided here. We prefer the PVC trough type feeders. And these birds are less than 2 weeks old. They're between 10 and 14 days old. And the feeder's already elevated. And as you can see, there's birds, hiding underneath the feeder. And this discourages, this is where the neck connects to the back again, and proper feeding is actually going to reduce your feed conversion ratio for growth. So growth, development, and laying. And the reason that happens is your full feeders encourage buffet eating, and if it's too low that they can get the leverage point again to get their beak in there and shovel feed around, it's going to cause sorting. So the other thing to keep in mind is don't overfeed. Okay, when you go back to feed and put new feed in the feeder, you're hoping to see about a 10% residual or leftovers in that feed trough. You never want it to go empty, but you also don't want it to be half or 3/4 full. This is a huge problem that I see amongst growers. They just keep putting more feed and more feed and more feed, and then they wonder why, their birds are sorting and they're throwing feed out on the ground. And well, the reason they're doing it is we've created buffet eaters. Okay, and what I mean is, they go back to the feeder often and they only eat what they want and they kick out or remove what doesn't look appealing to them. If we work on the 10% residual, then they're going to eat, and they realize that that food supply is not never ending, and there's a bottom in sight or an end in sight, then they're going to utilize the feed much more efficiently. Now, with that being said, commercial feeds, off the shelf that you may buy at a local feed store, brand name types feeds, when you're starting baby chicks for that first couple weeks, you probably should consider doing the 12-hour feed restriction or feed withdrawal. The reason for that is they formulate their feeds at a higher energy level, and that energy is coming from added oils and fats. And you really don't want to know where those oils and fats are coming from. Um, some of those are reclaimed restaurant grease. Some of that is animal tallow. Some of that is, whatever they can buy at the least cost, that week for making feed. But those fats, added fats that have been heated, rendered, processed, filtered, etc., are a little bit harder for the chicken's metabolism to digest. And it's going to steal a lot of oxygen out of the bloodstream for the breakdown of those fats. Whereas, for trail feed formulas, if you have access to those, do not require feed restriction or withdrawal. The fats in those diets are coming naturally out of oil seeds in the feed formulation. They've not been heated, rendered, filtered, and all that. They haven't gone through all the processing, so the body can absorb those and digest those much more efficiently than an added fat.
There are a few questions on this slide.
Okay.
How much feed savings will you see if you've got the feeder at the proper height?
In most cases, working closely with producers, I see a 20 to 25% reduction in feed use, just by keeping the feeders at the right height. Not only keeping the feeders at the right height, but also by not overfeeding the birds. Don't encourage the buffet eating. So if you're controlling, I don't want to use the word restricting or limiting, but if you're controlling the amount of feed in the feeder and the feeder height is set appropriately, then we can see a 20 to 25% reduction. Worst case scenario, we're seeing a 20 to 25, sometimes a 30%, feed usage rate drop.
Okay. Are there benefits of feeding more than one time a day?
There are benefits. The more often you actually come and put feed in the feeder, the more often you encourage the birds to come eat. Now, this is more on the meat bird production side. So every time you come put anything in that feeder, they're all going to run up and eat. It's a stimulus to them to think it's time to eat again. So they're going to run up to the feeder. They're all going to eat again. So the more times you can feed a day, the better. Again, keeping the 10% residual in mind, 5 to 10% residual. You want a little bit of powder remaining in the bottom of the feeder. That's perfectly fine. But yeah, the more times you feed them, the faster they're going to grow.
Do broilers and layers need feed during the night?
If it's a custom mix or a Fertrell blend, layers do not. Once a layer goes to roost, she's pretty much, she's out for the night. She's going to be sleeping. It's rare for a layer to get off of the roost in the middle of the night. However, the Cornish cross or the meat birds don't roost. Nobody usually provides roost for them, so they're on the ground. And if there's enough light, whether it's full moonlight, whether it's a yard light, or even if it's a brooder lamp, there's enough light for them. They will get up and eat some. It's not a heavy feeding period, but they will eat some throughout the night.
So in some of the colder temperatures, people will put heat lamps outside for either the layers or broilers to help them stay warm. Will the heat lamp light affect the feed consumption at night?
It's not the right spectrum of light to stimulate the bird, but it is enough light for them to go find food. Again, the layers are very patterned or habit forming. So they're gonna, when they go to roost or when they go to bed, they're pretty much done. So, they're gonna load up at the end of the day and have a full crop and a full gizzard. So they're not, and their eating habits are not the same as a broiler. Whereas a meat bird, yeah, they're gonna get up and they're gonna find some food, even under the light of a heat lamp, and that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so it's okay to leave um, feed for them in the evenings if there's a heat lamp there.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, all right, that's all the questions on that slide.
So let's continue with feeding chicks or feeding chickens. When they first show up, early on, day one, it's really good to have 1 inch of feeder space. Again, so this is linear feeder space or straight line feeder space. And you want to increase this by 1/4 of an inch weekly. So as long as you have them, we want to keep adding 1/4 of an inch until they get to maturity or they get to processing age. So for a Cornish cross or for a meat bird, this is going to be 3 to 4 inches per bird at 8 weeks of age. Um, People look out there and say, oh, I got plenty of feeder space. Think of it this way. Too much feeder space is better than not enough. And if you follow the guidelines that we've talked about already in this presentation, depending on what size you want your meat birds to be, um, they're going to be done long before they get to week 8. If you're doing the watering guidelines, the fresh air guidelines, the watering guidelines as far as space and availability, and you're doing the feeder space and availability as well as, restricting the feed a little bit or limiting, making sure there's some residue. Your typical Cornish crossbreed will actually be ready to harvest around 45 days of age and still give you a 4 to 4.5 pound carcass weight. If everything's what it needs, if everything's at right, we can take off a week to 10 days of grow out time. And to me, labor is the most expensive part of raising a chicken. Now, people don't pay themselves, they don't factor their labor and their time. But if you put a sign of value to the labor, labor soon becomes the most expensive part of managing poultry or any animal. So the other thing is the faster you get them in and get them out and get paid for those, it improves your cash flow, or it greatly improves your return on your investment. So if you get them out at 6.5 weeks old, that's a week and a half sooner, get them sold. That's money in your pocket at 6.5 weeks versus waiting 8 weeks till you get them sold. So there's a lot of financial benefits to raising your chickens right. Any questions on this slide?
No, not on this slide.
Okay. So we talked about appropriate feed particle size earlier, and I wanted to throw in some pictures just so you have a reference to how big the feed should be. These are examples of layer feed, chick feed, and I talked about the importance of grit, but you need to understand that chickens are inherently greedy. And the nature of a chicken is to eat the biggest pieces first. So when they run up to the feeder, if you watch them, and people don't spend enough time watching their chickens, but if you watch them, when they run up, okay, they're going to be looking for the biggest pieces first. So that's what they're going to peck out. And then, they'll keep coming back to the feeder and eating a little bit more and a little bit more. And each time they're looking for that, larger particle. So, I mean, if you can have uniform particle size, that reduces that a little bit, but it's not nearly as much fun to watch your chickens. But particle size, as you can see, all of these are very coarse textured feeds. There's not a lot of powder in these feeds. The majority of the feed is going to be that size that I talked about the same size as a kernel of wheat or a grain of wheat. I threw in the grit slide so you can see the particle size. This is the grower developer size grit. So after they're past about 4 weeks of age, this is going to be the size grit that we're looking for. And I want you to think about this for a second, is if you're not feeding grit, no grit is really actually inhumane when raising poultry. So it would be like me, be like you eating a steak without teeth. I set you down to this really awesome, steak or piece of meat, and you don't have the teeth to chew it with. So grit is equivalent to, teeth in most other animals. Questions on this slide?
No, there are no questions on this slide.
So I'm nearing the end of the presentation, and this is something this is a slide that I often use whenever I'm giving presentations and working with farmers or anyone actually in life. This is something that you need to think about. Just let this soak in, give this some thought. But I was sitting in an office of a man in upstate New York, and I looked up on his wall while I was waiting for him to come in, and I saw this sign. And of course, I asked his permission. Is it okay if I use this? And took a picture, and I've used this a lot in the last 15 or so years. But think about this for a second. Good, fast, and cheap. You can pick any two of the three. Okay, can't have all three. That's never going to happen. But you can pick any two of the three. So if you choose good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. And if you choose good and cheap, it's not going to be fast. And if you choose fast and cheap, there's not a chance in the world it's going to be good. Any questions on this slide?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Any general questions that we didn't cover? That's the end of my presentation.
Yeah, so if you follow your guidelines for good air quality, good water quality, and good feed quality, how much improvement do you expect to see? It's a good summary question.
It is a good summary question. And like I said a few slides back, is if a person follows all of these guidelines, all right, we're going to reduce the grow out time by 15%. So the length of time that it takes them to get there, we're going to reduce by 15%. And if we're following those feed guidelines and have good fresh water, we're going to reduce the feed consumption by just a safe number, say 20%. So if you're reducing your grow out time by 15% and you're reducing your feed consumption cost by 20%, I mean, this is a huge savings. And now you've also improved your return on your investment. How soon will you be able to, get your money back that you've invested in raising these birds? So I would say overall, with everything, included, you would be looking at about a 25% increase in profitability or a 25% decrease in cost of production, however you want to look at that.
Significant.
Significant, very significant.
All right, that's all the questions that we have for tonight, I think.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you attending. Have a nice evening.